May 1945. The Third Reich is dying. Hitler is gone. Berlin has fallen. Across Europe, armies that spent years trying to kill each other are stumbling toward an ending nobody quite knows how to write. But in a quiet Austrian valley, a medieval castle is still holding a group of French VIP prisoners the Nazis no longer need, and no longer are one left alive to talk. To save them, an American lieutenant and a German Wehrmacht major will end up defending the same war. A Waffen-SS officer will turn his back on his own side to join them. And somewhere in the last hours before this is over, one prisoner, a man once famous for a very different kind of contest, will have to walk out through enemy lines alone and hope he reaches help before the SS reach the castle. Schloss Itter sits above the village of Itter in North Tyrol. Thick stone walls, narrow mountain roads, a single approach up to the gate. Since 1943, the SS had used it not as a labor camp and not as a death camp, but as something rarer, a holding pen for people who mattered. A pair of former French prime ministers, two senior French generals, men who had once commanded armies, a former Wimbledon and French Open tennis champion, the sister of General Charles de Gaulle, high-value hostages kept in relative comfort, whose continued survival may have carried political weight for a regime that liked to keep something in reserve to bargain with in case the war ever turned against it. By the spring of 1945, the war had turned completely, and the men and women behind those walls had gone, almost overnight, from valuable leverage to loose ends. As German lines collapsed across the region, the SS guards who ran the castle began to melt away, one by one, into the mountains. That left the prisoners almost entirely unprotected, and with a growing specific fear. If the SS came back in force before the Americans arrived, would they simply execute everyone inside, rather than let the Allies find their hostages alive and talking? Someone had to get word out. A castle cook, Andreas Krobot, took the risk, slipping past the remaining guards to search for anyone who could help. He carried that warning to Josef Gangl, a Wehrmacht major who had already quietly turned against the regime he once served, working with Austrian resistance fighters to undermine what was left of the German war effort from the inside. Gangl understood immediately that his own small group wasn't enough to hold the castle alone, so he did something that could have gotten him shot on sight by either side of the war. He walked toward the nearest American position in full German uniform with a white cloth raised above his head. The nearest unit was a detachment of the 23rd Tank Battalion, 12th Armored Division, part of the US 7th Army's advance into Austria. Leading them was First Lieutenant John C. Jack Lee Jr., a tank officer who had spent the war learning to fight Germans, not to take orders from one, and certainly not to trust one offering an alliance out of nowhere. But Lee listened. A German major was standing in front of him, asking for help defending French former prime ministers and generals from other Germans in what everyone could tell were the war's final days. Lee didn't take long to decide. He would move on the castle with whatever he had on hand, and he would do it with Gangl, not around him. Lee began the move with more vehicles than he'd end up using, but a bridge along the route into Itter couldn't safely carry the weight of his heavier armor, and there was no time to find another way around. So the force that finally reached the castle was smaller, lighter, and far more exposed than the one that had set out. One Sherman tank, nicknamed Besotten Jenny, roughly 14 American soldiers, Major Gangl, and a handful of German troops loyal to him. No backup armor, no second tank in reserve. On the way in, the column ran straight into an SS roadblock. A brief, sharp exchange of gunfire cleared it, but it was a warning sign of exactly what was still out there, watching the roads. The joint force pushed on anyway and reached the castle gates. Inside the castle, the defenders gained one more addition nobody could have scripted. Waffen-SS officer Kurt-Siegfried Schrader, already stationed nearby, who chose to join them rather than fight for the regime he still technically served. An SS officer defending French hostages alongside the very Americans, his uniform had been built to fight. The French prisoners armed themselves from the castle's own stores. But this was not a united household simply because the danger was shared. Some of these politicians and generals had clashed for years, old political rivalries and personal grudges that hadn't cooled just because a common enemy was now approaching. That they picked up positions side by side at all, without those old feuds tearing the defense apart, was its own small miracle. Among them was Jean Borotra, the former tennis champion, a quiet presence for now, but a detail that would matter enormously before this day was over. Through the night and into early morning, probing shots and movement along the tree line signaled that the SS were closing in. Exact numbers are still debated, but somewhere between 100 and 150 Waffen-SS troops were converging on the castle, and historians now believe the picture wasn't even that simple. Some Wehrmacht personnel may have been mixed in among the attackers as well, meaning this wasn't a clean split between good Germans and SS fanatics. It was messier than that, right up to the final hours of the war. Elsewhere in the region, American forces were advancing, but inside the castle, no one knew whether word of the siege had reached anyone who could act on it, or whether help would arrive in time to matter. At dawn on May 5th, the real assault began. Mortar fire and machine gun bursts hit the castle from more than one direction at once, and the defenders scattered to whatever cover the old walls offered. Lee's Sherman held position at the gate, and for a stretch of that morning, its onboard radio was the defenders' only working link to the outside world. Their one real chance of telling anyone where they were and what they needed. Then, during the main assault, anti-tank fire found the tank and destroyed it, and that radio link died with it. From that point on, the defenders had no armor, no working communications, and no way to call for help. Just rifles, a handful of machine guns, and stone walls that had stood for centuries, but were never built to survive artillery and mortar fire. For hours, the defenders held their ground with what little firepower they had left, trading fire across the courtyard and through shattered windows. Then came the moment this battle is remembered for above all others. As the fighting pressed closer to the inner castle, Major Josef Gangl spotted danger closing in near former French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud, exposed in the open ground. Gangl moved to get him to cover. A sniper's round found Gangl first. He died shielding a man his own government had once held as a prisoner of the state. A German officer, in the last week of the war, killed while protecting a Frenchman from other Germans. Ammunition was running dangerously low. With the gate position lost and the tank destroyed, the defenders began pulling back toward the keep, the castle's strongest and most defensible inner section, ready to make a final stand there if it came to that. It was in this narrowing window, with no radio and no certainty anyone was coming, that Jean Borotra made his decision. The former tennis champion volunteered to leave the castle on foot, cross ground still contested by the SS, and try to reach the advancing Americans himself. Somehow, he made it through. Borotra's warning reached elements of the 2nd Battalion, 142nd Infantry Regiment, 36th Infantry Division, already advancing through the area. They turned towards the castle at once. The relief column struck the SS position from the outside, catching the attackers between the exhausted defenders still holding the keep and a fresh American assault coming from behind them. Under pressure from both directions, the SS line broke and scattered. When the guns finally went quiet, the castle had held. Every prisoner inside, the statesman, the generals, the tennis champion, the sister of Charles de Gaulle, was still alive. 3 days later, on May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The prisoners walked free, men and women who, hours earlier, had been firing rifles from the windows of a medieval fortress alongside the soldiers of the army that had once held them captive. Lieutenant Jack Lee was later promoted to captain and recognized for his actions that day, though the battle remained a lesser-known footnote of the war for decades. Josef Gangl was buried with honors by the town of Virgil, remembered not as an enemy soldier, but as a man who chose the right side when it cost him everything. This was never a clean story of nations or uniforms, and it doesn't need to be tidied up into one. In its final hours, it was a clash between people still serving a regime built on murder, and people, American, German, French, Austrian, who chose to protect whoever was standing in front of them when it mattered most. Jack Lee, promoted for a fight almost no one heard about for decades. Andreas Krobot, who risked his life just to carry a warning. Kurt-Siegfried Schrader, who turned his weapon the other way. Jean Borotra, who ran when running was the only option left. The prisoners who picked up rifles despite everything that divided them. And Josef Gangl, who didn't live to see the war end 3 days later. For a few hours above a small Austrian village, that was enough.